At 3 a.m. on April 18, 1942, the Pacific was black as ink. Waves broke against the hull of the USS Hornet, their rhythm slow and deliberate, like the breathing of something ancient and waiting. The deck was slick with rain. Men moved through the darkness in silence, shadows among machines, breath misting in the cold air. 16 bombers stood lined up, heavy and alien on the carrier's short deck. B-25 Mitchells, never meant for sea takeoffs. Their engines gleamed with condensation, and every man on board knew the same thing. None of them were coming back. Polished propellers caught faint reflections from the deck lights. The sea wind tore at flight jackets, carrying the smell of oil and salt. Somewhere below, the carrier's engines groaned as if sharing the tension. Every sound seemed louder than it should have been. The click of a wrench, the cough of a motor, the quick prayer whispered under breath. Colonel James Doolittle stood at the nose of his aircraft, a hand resting lightly on the metal skin. He was 45, short, sharp-eyed, the kind of man who didn't waste words. He looked over the line of bombers, the faces of the men who had volunteered without knowing what they were volunteering for. He said quietly, almost conversationally, "We're not flying for victory. We're flying to remind them we still exist." Someone laughed nervously. Someone else crossed himself. The air felt electric, as if the ocean itself held its breath. Far to the west, beyond 1,000 miles of hostile sea, Tokyo slept in peace. Radios murmured propaganda about inevitable triumphs. The emperor's subjects dreamed of empire and glory. No one imagined that, at that very moment, American bombers were rocking gently on a carrier deck, waiting for dawn. At 6 a.m., an urgent call came from the observation post. Japanese patrol vessels had spotted them. They were still 200 miles farther out than planned. Doolittle didn't hesitate. "Launch immediately," he ordered. The deck crew scrambled. Winds whipped at their coats. The ship turned into the storm to give the planes every inch of lift. The first bomber rolled forward, trembling under the weight of fuel and bombs. The pilot could see nothing but gray water ahead. Flaps down, throttles open. The engines roared, the deck shook, spray splashed up against the glass. The plane raced toward the edge, and for a heartbeat, it seemed it would fall. Then the nose lifted, the sea dropped away, and the bomber rose into the mist. Cheers erupted on deck, but they were hollow, restrained. Everyone knew it was only the first of 16. One by one, the rest followed, each takeoff a gamble between gravity and willpower. Some barely cleared the waves. From above, the Hornet looked like a dark scar against the endless ocean. Then it was gone behind the fog, and the bombers disappeared eastward into the storm. Inside Doolittle's cockpit, everything rattled. The horizon was invisible, swallowed by rain. His co-pilot, Dick Cole, adjusted the instruments, his knuckles white on the controls. "We'll never make it back," he muttered. Doolittle smiled without looking up. Wasn't planning to. They flew low, beneath the radar, guided only by dead reckoning and faith. The Pacific stretched endlessly beneath them, an indifferent witness. Doolittle opened his logbook and wrote a single line. "We are alive, and we are coming." Hours later, dawn broke over Japan. Far below, farmers began their morning routines, children walked to school, and smoke curled peacefully from factory chimneys. In the distance, a faint hum began to grow. Not thunder, not the wind, something new, impossible. At that same moment, on a hill outside Tokyo, an air defense officer raised his binoculars. He froze. What he saw made no sense. Silver planes, wide-winged and unfamiliar, moving in formation out of the clouds. He whispered, almost to himself, "Impossible. Those are American." And in the city below, the first siren began to wail, late, uncertain, and drowned out by the sound of engines that should have never reached this sky. The unthinkable was happening. The heart of the empire, untouched, invincible, was about to feel the war it had started. On the Hornet, hundreds of miles behind them, sailors leaned on the rails, watching the horizon where the bombers had vanished. No one spoke. They knew what those men were flying into, and that history was changing somewhere beyond the storm. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, America had struck back. And far ahead, through the mist, Tokyo waited, unaware that in a few short hours, the world would hold its breath for the sound of fire falling from the sky. "Where are you watching from?" Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. At 11:45 a.m., the first people in Tokyo heard it, a low, unfamiliar rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Housewives on balconies paused with their laundry still in their hands. Street vendors looked up, shielding their eyes from the sun. Children pointed toward the horizon. At first, no one reacted. The Japanese mainland had never been attacked. The newspapers said the American fleet was crushed, their air power scattered across the Pacific. Whatever was making that sound, it couldn't possibly be the enemy. Then the shadows appeared. For silver planes swept over the city, sunlight flashing off their wings. No insignia was visible at first, only the dark underbellies and the growl of engines. Seconds later, someone shouted, "They're not ours," and the illusion shattered. The sirens failed to start immediately. Radar stations hadn't registered anything. No one expected bombers to appear out of nowhere. By the time the first warning blared, the planes were already dropping low. Colonel James Doolittle's bomber came in over the Eastern District, engines trembling as it cut through rising columns of smoke. His crew worked wordlessly. The bombardier, Sergeant Nolan, squinted through the sight, whispering numbers. Target, industrial plant online. Doolittle nodded once. Release. The bay doors opened. The aircraft jolted slightly. For bombs fell, trailing silver arcs against the gray sky. A moment later, the city erupted. The explosions weren't massive, not compared to what would come later in the war, but their psychological weight was enormous. Fire leapt from factory roofs, glass shattered across streets, telephone poles toppled. The Japanese capital, the beating heart of an empire that believed itself untouchable, was burning. From the ground, witnesses later wrote of confusion rather than terror. A shopkeeper's diary found years later contained the line, "We looked up and saw American planes. They said those men were dead, but they are alive, and they are here." Civilians scattered. Fire crews rushed to the industrial districts, not yet understanding the scale of what was happening. Within minutes, more planes roared overhead, 16 in all, each striking a different city: Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Kobe. In Doolittle's cockpit, the radio crackled. Target hit, fires spreading. Then silence. Another voice came through, strained and distant. "We're through. Heading east." The colonel exhaled, eyes fixed on the horizon. He knew they wouldn't make it back to the carrier. They were already deep over enemy territory, running on borrowed fuel. But they had done what no one thought possible. Over the city, the air shimmered with heat and dust. From the Imperial Palace, officials rushed into bunkers. The emperor was moved to safety. And in the chaos, General Tojo was briefed with a single sentence that froze the room. American bombers struck Tokyo. He didn't believe it. "That's absurd," he snapped. "They cannot reach us." But the proof was outside his window. Columns of black smoke curling upward into the sky, like a question the Empire couldn't yet answer. For the American crews, the silence after the bombing was worse than the attack itself. They could see the city shrinking behind them, fire blooming like red blossoms across the rooftops. No cheers, no triumph. Only the heavy realization of what they had unleashed. Inside one bomber, a young gunner named Chase scribbled in his logbook with shaking hands. "I saw a man on a bridge watching us. He didn't run, just watched. I wonder what he thought we were." They flew low, skimming treetops, chased by bursts of anti-aircraft fire that came too late. The flak was scattered, panicked. The Japanese gunners had no idea what altitude or direction to shoot. As the planes passed over the coastline, the crews saw the vast stretch of ocean ahead, gray, endless, indifferent. It was both salvation and sentence. Their fuel gauges hovered near empty. "Radio check," Doolittle said calmly. Only static answered. The crew exchanged glances. He didn't need to say it. They all knew. China lay hundreds of miles away, maybe beyond reach. Below them, Japanese fishermen pointed from their boats, watching the bombers vanish into the clouds. The capital behind them burned faintly on the horizon. In Tokyo, hours later, the fires still smoldered. Civilians wandered the streets, dazed, clutching photographs, buckets, or nothing at all. News bulletins were vague. Enemy planes inflicted minor damage. But everyone understood what it meant. The war had come home. A housewife, writing in her diary that night, described a moment of silence after the all-clear siren. The air smelled of smoke and salt. I kept waiting to hear them again. It was the first time I felt afraid that Japan could lose. In Washington, word of success reached the War Department. Radios carried brief bulletins. American planes strike Tokyo. Across the country, people cheered, cried, stood in the streets. No one yet knew what had happened to the men who made it possible. And somewhere over the Pacific, 16 crews kept flying east into night. Their planes lighter, their fuel thinner, their hope flickering like the last light of day. Doolittle looked once over his shoulder, through the small window where the smoke of Tokyo was still faintly visible. Then he turned back to the compass, eyes hard, voice low. "Gentlemen," he said, "let's find China." But the sky ahead was growing darker, and the numbers on the fuel gauge were falling faster than anyone dared to say aloud. They had proven that the impossible could be done. Now they would discover what it would cost. They left Tokyo behind them, swallowed by cloud and distance, but the sense of unreality stayed. For hours, the bombers flew east, over fields, mountains, and a coastline now hidden by smoke. No music on the radio, no chatter, only the growl of engines running low on fuel and the quiet, rhythmic breathing of men who knew the odds. Inside Doolittle's plane, the cockpit light flickered. Every few minutes, the colonel checked his compass, then the horizon, then the fuel gauge, always the same numbers falling. They had launched 200 miles earlier than planned. That meant 200 miles more to fly. 200 miles they didn't have. Sergeant Cole glanced at the map, pencil tapping nervously. "We'll hit the coast by nightfall," he said. "If we're lucky," Doolittle replied. "If not, well, we swim." Outside, the wind had changed. Sheets of rain lashed the glass. The clouds dropped lower, and visibility vanished to almost nothing. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled. The Pacific stretched out like a gray abyss waiting to collect them. In the back, one of the gunners whispered a prayer, not for survival, but for a clean end. No one wanted to fall into Japanese hands. They all knew what capture might mean. The silence after the engines was the scariest thing to imagine. By dusk, they were flying blind. The sun had vanished into a solid wall of storm. Instruments rattled, compasses spun. The radio hissed, alive with nothing but static. Occasionally, a faint voice would crackle through. Out of fuel, losing altitude, then disappear. One by one, the bombers scattered across the darkening sky. Doolittle's crew fought to stay level. The altimeter dropped. The rain turned to needles against the glass. Cole wiped condensation from his goggles, trying to spot the coastline of China, but there was only night. In the tail section, the gunner shouted over the noise, "Sir, we're running on fumes." Doolittle didn't answer. He already knew. He reached for the intercom. "Prepare to bail out when I give the order." There was a pause, then a voice. Understood. It wasn't fear that filled the plane, but something heavier, resignation. They had done what they came for. They had struck Tokyo. No one could take that away from them. At 9 p.m., the engines began to sputter. The right propeller coughed once, twice, then died. The bomber tilted sharply. Lights flickered and went out. Doolittle's voice was steady. "All right, boys. Time to go." One by one, the crew leapt into the void. The roar of wind swallowed everything. No shouts, no sound of the plane, just the emptiness of falling through rain and cloud. For seconds, there was nothing, then the violent jerk of the parachute opening. Doolittle's boots hit the ground hard, mud splashing up his legs. He rolled, caught his breath, and realized he was alive. Somewhere nearby, he could hear water, a river, fast and deep. The air smelled of bamboo and wet soil. He shouted into the darkness. "Cole, Chase, anyone?" Only the wind answered. Elsewhere across the stormy night, other crews met their fates. One bomber ditched into the sea, its crew never found. Another crashed into a rice paddy, the impact scattering debris across the fields. Some were rescued by Chinese villagers, hidden in barns and temples. Others were captured almost immediately. In a small village near Ningbo, a farmer named Lin saw parachutes drifting down. He ran toward the fields and found two foreigners, soaked, bleeding, unconscious. He didn't know who they were, but he knew the Japanese would kill them if found. He brought them into his home, lit a small fire, and whispered to his wife, "Tonight, we keep strangers alive." Meanwhile, in occupied China, Japanese troops began searching. Reports of downed American planes spread quickly. Orders came from Tokyo, "Find them." Make an example. By dawn, only a handful of crews were still unaccounted for. Doolittle, shivering and exhausted, stumbled toward a light he thought might be a village. Instead, it was a lone Chinese soldier with a rifle raised. For a moment, neither moved. Then the soldier lowered his weapon and said something in Mandarin that Doolittle couldn't understand, but the tone was kind. He gestured toward the hills. Safe. Hours later, word reached Chongqing. American pilots found alive. The news traveled fast. In Washington, no one yet knew that Doolittle himself had survived. He believed the mission had been a failure. Every plane lost, men missing or dead. I've doomed them all, he told an officer who later recorded his words. But halfway across the world, the reaction was the opposite. Newspapers screamed the headlines. Tokyo bombed. Crowds poured into the streets. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, America felt it could win. In Tokyo, the mood was darker. The Imperial General Staff gathered in a dimly lit chamber, maps spread across the table. Smoke still hung over parts of the capital. Admiral Yamamoto stood silently, his face unreadable. Someone muttered, "They came from the sea." Another said, "No, from China." Yamamoto spoke quietly, but his words chilled the room. "If they reached us once, they will reach us again." That night, he issued orders that would change the course of the Pacific War. Strengthen defenses, seize more of China's coast, and punish the civilians who helped the Americans. And somewhere in a muddy Chinese field, Colonel Doolittle sat by a dying fire, his boots drying in the smoke. The mission was over. The cost was just beginning. He looked up at the stars barely visible through the storm and whispered to himself, "We showed them we could reach their sky, but God helped the people beneath it." In Tokyo's war ministry, the air was still heavy with smoke from the fires that had scarred the capital. The meeting room was silent except for the rustle of papers and the faint hum of electric lights. Every man inside wore the same expression, disbelief turned to fury. General Hideki Tojo stood at the head of the table, his jaw clenched, his hands trembling not with fear, but humiliation. The unthinkable had happened. American bombers had flown over the heart of the empire, dropped their payloads, and vanished into the clouds. The emperor's city, untouchable, sacred, had been violated. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Tojo slammed his hand against the table so hard that the inkpot spilled. "Find them," he barked. "Find every last one of them." That order became the pulse of the next months, a hunt not just for the Americans, but for everyone who might have helped them. The radio never mentioned the raid. Newspapers printed stories about minor explosions in the Tokyo outskirts. Civilians were told not to spread rumors. But inside military headquarters, rage had turned cold and methodical. Plans were already underway for a punishment that would echo far beyond the skies of Japan. Across the East China Sea, Japanese troops received new orders. They were to comb the provinces of Zhejiang and Jiangxi, where American airmen were rumored to have landed. The mission had a single purpose: to erase every trace of the men who had humiliated the empire. Tens of thousands of soldiers moved inland. Villages were searched, houses burned, walls poisoned. Anyone suspected of aiding the foreigners was executed on the spot. In a remote farming village near Tsuzhou, the headman, a man named Liang, later described what happened. "He fell from the sky, young, injured. His leg was bleeding. We thought he was a man who needed help, so we hid him in the barn. We gave him water. My wife gave him rice. That night, he thanked us. The next morning, soldiers came." Liang's voice, recorded years later, trembled. "They said we had sheltered the enemy. They took him away. Then they came back for us. My house burned first." Within weeks, the region became a wasteland. Japanese field reports from that period, uncovered after the war, described the cleansing operations in dry, bureaucratic language. But the reality was chaos and blood. Estimates vary, but as many as 250,000 Chinese civilians were killed in the reprisals. For every American rescued, entire communities were erased. In Chongqing, Chinese officials begged the Allies to understand the scale of what was happening. American intelligence intercepted fragments of Japanese radio traffic, coded words about counterinsurgency and containment. But no one in Washington yet grasped the magnitude of the tragedy that had unfolded because of one daring mission. Meanwhile, Japanese propaganda twisted the story into victory. Publicly, the government declared that several American criminal airmen had been captured and would face justice for bombing civilians. In private, the orders were darker: interrogate, execute, and bury the rest. The contrast between Tokyo and the Chinese countryside could not have been greater. In the capital, soldiers marched under bright flags, proclaiming the empire's strength restored. In the fields of eastern China, smoke rose from the ruins of villages that had never even heard of Doolittle or his raid. An eyewitness from the time, a young monk who survived by hiding in a cave, later said, "We looked up at the sky every night. We thought perhaps more men would fall from it. But after what happened, we no longer prayed for that. We prayed that the sky would stay empty." Back in Japan, the generals studied maps, furious and humiliated but more determined than ever. Tojo ordered that all future attacks on the homeland must be impossible. Radar networks expanded. Patrols doubled. But even as he prepared defenses, his pride demanded vengeance, not just against America, but against China, which had dared to harbor its enemy. The punishment continued for months. Rivers clogged with debris. Entire families disappeared without a trace. And all because, one night, a handful of villagers had chosen compassion over fear. In Washington, news trickled in slowly. American intelligence learned that Japanese troops had massacred civilians in regions near where Doolittle's men had landed. The reports were confused, incomplete, but horrifying. When Doolittle himself heard the first rumors, he sat in silence for a long time. Then, in his calm, precise way, he said, "We struck a military target. They struck the innocent. But that doesn't wash the blood off our hands." He would later write in his private journal, "War gives you victory, but it takes something you can't ever reclaim. Those people died because we showed the enemy he could bleed." For the men who survived the raid, the knowledge came like a weight they would carry forever. They had risked their lives for a message, and now thousands of others had paid for that message with theirs. In the temples of southern China, the ashes of the burned villages still drifted on the wind. Somewhere among them lay the remnants of an American parachute, a shred of fabric once tied to a symbol of courage, now indistinguishable from the smoke of vengeance. When historians later asked Doolittle if the raid had been worth it, he paused before answering. "It proved we could fight back," he said quietly. "But it also proved that courage isn't always clean." And as word of the massacres spread, even across the cheering cities of America, a grim understanding began to form. Every act of defiance carried a shadow. Somewhere, in a burned-out Chinese village, an old man buried a piece of metal from a plane he never understood and whispered to the sky, "We saved one life that night, but we lost 1,000. The Doolittle raid had ended. The consequences had just begun. There were 80 men who flew toward Japan. Only 64 made it out alive. 8, exhausted, starving, lost behind enemy lines, fell into Japanese hands. Their capture began in silence. Near Ningbo, a squad of Japanese soldiers surrounded a farmhouse where 2 Americans were hiding. The villagers swore they were missionaries. The soldiers didn't listen. Within hours, all 8 airmen were found, dragged from the hills, the coast, and the broken fields of eastern China. They were flown to Shanghai, blindfolded and handcuffed. From that moment, they ceased to exist. Officially, they weren't soldiers, they were criminals. The Japanese government refused to admit that the raid on Tokyo had succeeded, so the men who proved it had to disappear. Their cells were narrow, damp, without light. Days and nights blurred together. They were fed rice water twice a day, sometimes a piece of bread. No letters, no news. Just the sound of guards' boots and the drip of water down the walls. Corporal Jacob de Shazer would later write, "We didn't know if anyone knew we were alive. Sometimes I hoped they didn't. It was easier that way." Interrogations came at night. Men were beaten until their teeth cracked. The guards demanded answers about the raid, where they'd come from, how many bombers America still had. The airmen told them nothing. When torture failed, the guards left them alone. Days of silence, so long that their own thoughts became enemies. In October 1942, 4 of the 8 were taken from their cells. The others heard footsteps fade down the corridor. Then a single shot. Then another. And then nothing. They never returned. The remaining 4 were moved to solitary confinement. No windows, no voices. Lieutenant Robert Hite later recalled, "After a while, you stop fearing death. You just stop expecting anything. You learn the creak of every hinge, the sound of your own breathing. Christmas Eve, 1943. The guards forgot to bring dinner. In the dark, one prisoner began to hum Silent Night. The others joined, voices thin, trembling. For a moment, the war stopped. When they finished, a guard whispered through the door, one quiet word, home. That word carried them through another year. By the time liberation came in 1945, only 4 were still alive, emaciated, blind from darkness, barely able to stand. When American soldiers opened their cells, they didn't cheer. They just blinked at the sunlight, afraid it wasn't real. In the hospital, one of them was handed a mirror. He pushed it away. "I don't need to see what's left," he said. When Doolittle received the report, he read it twice and went silent. Then he said softly, "They fought their own war, without guns, without wings. And they won it by staying human." In Japan, their captors buried the truth. The executed men were called traitors to humanity. Their graves were left unmarked. For years, even their families didn't know how or where they'd died. But among the Allied ranks, the story spread, whispered between soldiers, passed from base to base. The tale of the 8 men who vanished after Tokyo became a quiet legend. Lieutenant Haight later wrote from his home in Tennessee, "We weren't heroes. Heroes die clean. We just kept breathing when the world told us not to." While America celebrated new victories, the Coral Sea, Guadalcanal, these men lived in the memory of those who understood what the raid had truly cost. Their suffering gave the mission its weight, its humanity. When the war ended, the 4 survivors stood under the open sky for the first time in years. One of them looked up at the stars and whispered, "We made it back to the sky." And somewhere across the ocean, in the White House, President Roosevelt signed a new order. His tone was calm, but every word was final. "They struck us at Pearl Harbor. We struck their capital. Now we take the Pacific itself." The Doolittle raid had lit the spark. The fire was about to spread. In Tokyo, the news of the raid was treated like a rumor that refused to die. Officials insisted it had been an isolated incident, but inside the Imperial General Staff, panic simmered beneath polished uniforms. If American bombers could strike the Emperor's city once, they could do it again. Admiral Yamamoto, the mastermind of Pearl Harbor, sat in his office surrounded by maps of the Pacific. His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed sleepless nights. "We underestimated them," he said. "They are not broken. They are awakening." For the Japanese High Command, the conclusion was clear. America had to be stopped before it could strike again. To protect the homeland, Japan needed to push its defensive perimeter farther east to dominate the entire Pacific. Every island, every atoll, every stretch of ocean would become a shield around the empire. Thus began the chain of events that would lead to one of the most decisive battles in history, Midway. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the United States was transforming. Before the Doolittle raid, the war had felt distant to many Americans, a fight far away, after the humiliation of Pearl Harbor. But the moment those B-25s dropped their bombs over Tokyo, everything changed. The impossible had become possible again. Newspapers shouted it from every headline. "Americans strike Japan." Crowds gathered in the streets of New York, Chicago, San Francisco. Strangers shook hands. One woman wrote in her diary, "We thought we had forgotten how to win. Today we remembered." Factories that once built cars now roared with the sound of bombers. Shipyards worked through the night. In Washington, Roosevelt smiled for the first time in months. "We've given them hope," he told his aides. "Now we give them purpose." The Doolittle raid had not destroyed much. The damage to Tokyo was minor, but its effect on morale was seismic. In Japan, it exposed vulnerability. In America, it lit a fire that would not go out. Yet even as morale soared, Doolittle himself sat quietly, burdened by the knowledge of what his raid had unleashed, the massacres in China, the captured men, the vengeance that followed. "It's strange," he told one fellow officer. "We set out to prove our courage, and in doing so, we proved everyone's cruelty." But history had already moved forward. The Japanese Navy, still confident, planned its next move, a trap that would lure what remained of the American fleet into destruction. Yamamoto believed the Americans were weak, disorganized, still licking their wounds. What he didn't know was that American cryptographers had already cracked his naval codes. The hunters were walking into their own ambush. By June 1942, the stage was set. 4 Japanese carriers, the pride of the Imperial Navy, sailed toward Midway Atoll. They believed they were invisible, unstoppable. But across the ocean, Admiral Nimitz waited with a quiet confidence born not of arrogance, but of information. In Washington, intelligence officers traced Yamamoto's messages, marking his fleets on secret maps. One of them wrote in his report, "Tokyo fears another Doolittle. They will get something far worse." On June 4th, the skies over Midway erupted. The Japanese launched the first attack, confident their pilots would sweep the Americans aside. But in less than 5 minutes, the tide turned. U.S. dive bombers found their targets. 4 Japanese carriers burning, their decks collapsing under waves of fire. It was more than a victory. It was the turning point of the Pacific War. In Tokyo, word of the disaster arrived like a funeral bell. No public statement was made for days. Even the emperor was told cautiously, as if the truth itself might be treason. But among Japan's inner circle, there was no doubt. The Doolittle raid had forced their hand, had drawn them into a battle they could not win. Their pride had built the path to Midway, and Midway had destroyed that pride forever. In the United States, the mood shifted again. The victory was celebrated, but beneath the cheers lay something deeper, a grim awareness that the war was far from over, and that this was only the beginning of a long, brutal reckoning. Back in his home in California, Doolittle received a telegram from Nimitz himself. "Your raid was the first spark. Midway was the flame." He read it once, folded the paper, and said to his wife quietly, "Then God help us all, because now the fire won't stop." The giant that had slept since Pearl Harbor was awake, and across the Pacific, Japan could already hear its footsteps. June 4th, 1942. The Pacific was silent, too silent. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, believed he held the advantage. The plan was perfect, at least on paper. Midway Atoll would be the bait. Once the Americans rushed to defend it, the Imperial Navy, the pride of Japan, would ambush and annihilate what was left of the U.S. fleet. It was revenge for the Doolittle raid, crafted with precision and arrogance. But Yamamoto didn't know that his most secret codes had already been broken. Deep in a concrete bunker on Pearl Harbor, U.S. Navy cryptanalysts had cracked JN 25. They knew when and where Japan would strike. Admiral Chester Nimitz read the decrypted messages and smiled thinly. "They're coming," he said. "Let's be ready to meet them." The Americans were outnumbered and outgunned, but they had one weapon Japan didn't: knowledge. The ocean would become the stage for the most extraordinary trap in modern naval history. At dawn, Japanese planes roared toward Midway, bombing the island's airfields. The defenders, though battered, fought back fiercely. Radio operators shouted coordinates. Smoke rose from burning hangars. At sea, Japanese officers celebrated. They believed they had caught the enemy off guard. They were wrong. Hundreds of miles to the northeast, 3 American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, waited silently. Their decks were slick with sea spray and aviation fuel. Pilots crouched in cockpits, hearts pounding. When the order came, "Launch all aircraft," the sound was deafening. Dozens of dive bombers took to the air, engines screaming against the wind. One pilot muttered into his radio, "For Pearl Harbor, and for those boys who hit Tokyo." The first waves missed their targets. Anti-aircraft fire tore through the sky. Planes plunged into the ocean, leaving trails of smoke. But fate has its moments: small, precise, merciless. Around 10:20 a.m., 3 American squadrons arrived above the Japanese fleet at the same time. Below them, 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, had their decks cluttered with refueling planes and bombs. They were moments away from launching their own strike. Then the dive bombers appeared out of the sun. In less than 5 minutes, everything changed. The first bomb hit Kaga, igniting fuel lines. A second tore through Akagi's flight deck. Flames rolled across the ocean as secondary explosions ripped through hangars filled with aircraft and ammunition. One Japanese sailor described it later. "The sea itself was on fire. We watched our empire burn before our eyes." Within hours, 3 carriers were gone. The fourth, Hiryu, managed a desperate counterattack that crippled the Yorktown, but by nightfall, she too was a floating inferno. In the Japanese command center, An officer handed Yamamoto the final report. 4 carriers lost. Over 3,000 men dead. The admiral didn't speak. He simply bowed his head. One aide would later recall. The silence was worse than any explosion. That was the moment we understood. The war had turned. Across the Pacific, the mood was electric. The radio broadcasts were cautious at first, then triumphant. U.S. Navy victorious at Midway. Crowds filled American streets again, waving flags, crying, laughing. The country that had been humiliated at Pearl Harbor now stood taller than ever. But behind the celebration was a quiet irony. Midway, the battle born from vengeance, had destroyed the very fleet that sought to avenge Japan's pride. The Doolittle raid, meant only as a symbolic strike, had forced the empire into a reckless gamble, and it had lost everything. In Tokyo, the public was told nothing. Newspapers printed vague words like setback and reorganization. But rumors spread quickly. Families of sailors received letters marked, missing in action. For the first time since the war began, people began to whisper, if the Navy could be beaten, what else could fall? Yamamoto's officers gathered around him that night. One asked what they should tell the emperor. The admiral looked out at the Black Ocean and said quietly, "Tell His Majesty, the empire has lost its future." Thousands of miles away, in Washington, Doolittle was summoned to the White House. He stood before President Roosevelt, the same man who had authorized his impossible raid only months earlier. Roosevelt asked softly, "Would you do it again, Colonel?" Doolittle hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "In any sky, on any day," he said. Because it wasn't about winning. It was about showing we still could. The president smiled, but behind that smile was the weight of history shifting. Midway was not the end. It was the beginning of Japan's decline, the first unmistakable sign that the tide of the Pacific War had turned. And though the world didn't yet know it, the men who had once bombed Tokyo had lit the path to its downfall. They called them the men who vanished. For years, no one knew where they had gone, or if they were even still alive. After the Doolittle raid, 16 crews disappeared into history. Some made it home through China, others were lost at sea, and 8 fell into Japanese hands. Their fate was buried in silence, classified in files stamped top secret. Their families told only one word: missing. It wasn't until the war's final months that the truth began to surface, one brittle document, one testimony at a time. In 1945, after Japan's surrender, Allied investigators opened the archives of the Kempeitai, the Japanese military police. Inside, they found reports titled simply, "Interrogation of American Airmen, April 1942." The handwriting was neat, the tone clinical, but the words described something far darker. Executions, beatings, starvation. At the bottom of one file was a list of names, followed by 2 words, "Sentence carried out." Captain Dean Hallmark, Lieutenant William Farrow, Sergeant Harold Spatz, Corporal Chase Nielsen. 4 of the Doolittle men, executed in Shanghai. The others, tortured and imprisoned for years. The discovery hit the United States like a delayed explosion. The men who had once been celebrated as national heroes were mourned all over again. Newspapers printed their names under black headlines. Doolittle Airmen executed by Japan. Families who had clung to hope for 3 years finally received confirmation, but no closure. In China, villagers came forward with stories of how they had hidden the wounded airmen, risking everything. An old farmer from Zhejiang told an American investigator, "He was bleeding and couldn't walk. My wife gave him rice. The next day, the soldiers came. They burned our village." Those who survived the manhunt remembered the faces of the people who helped them and the price those people paid. For many, it became a lifelong burden. Lieutenant Chase Nielsen, one of the survivors, testified after the war. "I saw good people die because they gave me water. I lived, and I never stopped asking why." In the ruins of Tokyo, Allied officers pieced together what had happened. The order for the executions had come from the highest levels, approved by the War Ministry itself. The men were denied trials, denied names. Their deaths were meant to erase the memory of the raid that had humiliated an empire. But memory has a way of surviving. When the war ended, the surviving Doolittle raiders returned home. Most were gaunt, quiet, unrecognizable from the photos once printed in magazines. They avoided parades. Some couldn't sleep for years. One of them said, We came back from the sky, but part of us stayed up there. In 1946, the War Crimes Tribunal in Shanghai opened proceedings against the officers responsible for the airmen's torture and execution. In the courtroom, an interpreter read the charges aloud. The accused bowed their heads, but said nothing. Justice came slowly, and never completely. At the same time, America began to honor the men it had lost. President Truman signed the posthumous citations. Families were invited to ceremonies in Washington. Mothers stood in black dresses, clutching framed photographs of sons who never came home. When Doolittle himself received the Medal of Honor, he hesitated. He looked at the rows of press cameras, then at the gold medal in his hand, and said softly, "I accept this not for what we did, but for those who didn't make it back." Behind him, a Marine band played the Star-Spangled Banner. Reporters wrote that his voice broke on the last word. But the story of the Doolittle Raiders didn't end with medals or trials. In small American towns, widows kept their husbands' letters in boxes, letters written on the voyage to Japan, full of jokes and confidence, unaware of what awaited them. In China, families who had sheltered the airmen left offerings on burned ground every year: rice, incense, folded paper cranes. For decades, the truth remained buried in dusty folders, sealed behind military classifications. It wasn't until the 1980s that the last of the secret documents were declassified. Inside were photographs of the captured airmen, reports of their interrogations, and even a coded note from one of them, scratched into a wooden wall. "Tell them we did not break." That single sentence became the Raiders' legacy, not of victory, but of endurance. When asked years later what the Doolittle Raid truly meant, one historian said, "It wasn't a strike on Tokyo. It was a message written in fire that freedom doesn't hide behind oceans." And yet, among the survivors, there was no triumph. Only quiet respect for the men whose courage had been erased by secrecy. One of them, gray-haired and blind in one eye, told a reporter in 1960, "The raid was over in hours. But for some of us, it never ended." For the world, Doolittle's name became a symbol of daring. For the men who followed him, it was a reminder of sacrifice. And as the Cold War began and the next generation of bombers rose into the skies, the old pilots gathered once a year, raising silver goblets in remembrance. Each cup bore a name. Each year, a few fewer hands were left to lift them. At their final reunion, when only a handful remained, one of the men whispered. They called it a suicide mission. Maybe it was, but it showed the world what belief can do. The Doolittle Raid had begun as vengeance. It ended as testimony, a reminder that courage doesn't need to survive to be remembered. Tokyo burned again, this time not from 16 bombers, but from thousands. By March 1945, the city was no longer a symbol of invincibility. It was a field of ash, its wooden houses swallowed by firestorms that roared for miles. The night sky glowed orange, and the air smelled of smoke, fuel, and grief. American B-29 superfortresses flew in endless waves, their bellies loaded with incendiaries. Whole districts vanished in hours. From above, the crews could see rivers of flame twisting through the darkness, swallowing everything. Below, survivors crawled through the ruins, coughing, blinded, searching for air. An elderly Japanese pilot, once stationed in Tokyo during the Doolittle Raid, wrote in his diary that night, "We used to laugh when the sirens sounded in 1942. The bombs were small, the fires brief. Now the fires have no end. Doolittle was the omen, we just didn't know it." 3 years earlier, the sound of a single bomber had been a shock. Now it was routine. The war that began with surprise had ended with inevitability. Half a world away, in California, James Doolittle sat in a small house overlooking the Pacific. The war had made him a general, a hero, a legend, but he wore none of it easily. He had led men into the sky knowing many would never return. And though the victory was complete, the weight of it never left his shoulders. On his desk sat a single photograph, 16 B-25s lined up on the deck of the USS Hornet, ready for takeoff. He ran a finger along the frame, tracing the faces of men he once commanded. "We were all so young," he whispered. He had been invited to Tokyo after the surrender, but refused. "I've seen enough of fire," he told a journalist. Instead, he wrote in his private notes, "We didn't bomb cities to hate them. We did it so no city would ever have to fear again." But I wonder if fear ever really leaves. In Tokyo, the ruins still smoldered when Emperor Hirohito recorded his surrender speech. People gathered around crackling radios, listening to a voice they had never heard before. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, he said, his tone calm, almost gentle. The words were historic, but what lingered was the silence afterward, the sound of an empire ending. One Japanese teacher who survived the bombings later described walking through the city after the announcement. The ground was hot. The sky was gray. I saw a child holding a burned toy plane. He said, the Americans won because their planes were bigger. But it wasn't size. It was something else. Something inside them we couldn't understand. In Washington, Doolittle followed the news quietly. When he heard that Tokyo had surrendered, he closed his eyes. His aide later recalled that he didn't celebrate. He simply stood up, walked to the window, and watched the sunset over the Pacific. It's over, he said. Then, after a pause, but it'll never really be over. For Doolittle, the end of the war brought reflection, not relief. He refused to see himself as a hero. The real heroes, he told a reporter, are the ones who stayed behind in the wreckage. His medals gathered dust in a drawer. What he carried instead were memories, the whine of engines, the trembling of the Hornet's deck, the faces of men disappearing into cloud and flame. In 1946, he visited a military hospital and met a young bomber pilot who had lost his sight in a raid over Japan. The man asked him, "Sir, was it worth it?" Doolittle didn't answer right away. He sat beside the bed and said quietly, "It depends on what we do next." Time passed. Cities were rebuilt. The enemies of yesterday became allies. Japan adopted democracy, rebuilt its industry, and turned to peace. American bombers no longer flew overhead. They brought mail, goods, and hope. The scars of the war didn't fade, but they became part of something larger, a fragile understanding that the sky no longer belonged to fear. Decades later, when Doolittle was an old man, he received a letter from Tokyo. It was from the son of a pilot who had fought in the Pacific. The letter said simply, "My father taught me that courage is not killing without fear, but living without hatred." You taught him that. Doolittle read it twice and smiled faintly. He wrote a short reply. If that's true, then maybe everything we endured meant something after all. By the 1970s, only a handful of the original raiders were still alive. Each year they met in quiet halls, raising silver goblets engraved with their names. One cup remained inverted for each man who had passed. When the last survivor drank, he would turn his own cup over, and the ceremony would end forever. At their final reunion, a reporter asked one of the old pilots what the Doolittle raid truly meant. He stared into his glass for a long time before answering. It meant we dared to reach across the ocean and prove that fear wasn't infinite. That's all. He set the cup down and looked toward the night sky. Funny, he added. The world thought we flew to start a war, but maybe we flew to end one. Tokyo had once seemed untouchable. Then it became ashes. Then it became light again. History remembered the Doolittle raiders as the men who struck the first blow. But their legacy was not destruction, it was defiance. It was proof that courage could outlast fire, and that even in the darkest years, humanity could still rise from the smoke. The war had ended in blinding light, but its lesson remained simple, unchanging. War does not end when the bombs fall silent. It ends when people stop fearing the sky,